Welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast. This is a show that focuses on ecological restoration. I'm your host, Michael Yadrick, and I am an ecological restoration practitioner living in Puyallup Territory, now known as Tacoma, Washington. And this is the episode digging into underground seed banks, passive restoration, and ecological memory. I think this is a short one, no guests, just me exploring one of those topics trending in restoration right now that deserves to be highlighted. I deeply appreciate your support as listeners of this independent show. Your enthusiasm keeps me motivated to bring you insightful content on how restoration influences human health, livelihoods, and justice in a warming world. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review, sharing it with friends, and subscribing for more. Your support helps me continue exploring the important conversations and ecological restoration efforts that help heal our world. Thank you for being part of the community. And I appreciate whatever you might be doing while you listen. Whether you're grabbing your headphones for your morning commute, walking the dogs, falling asleep, maybe you're just passing some time or blowing off some work, I'm glad you're here. One fascinating topic in ecological restoration is the acknowledgement of underground seed banks to support native plant regeneration. This approach, which leverages the seeds already present in the soil, has shown promise in various projects. I do want to note this episode was inspired by a High Country News article that keeps coming up in my feed titled "Underground Seed Banks Hold Promise for Ecological Restoration: How Indigenous Science is Using Natural Regeneration to Restore Western Ecosystems." It's by Josephine Woolington in the spring of 2024, and I'll link it in the show notes. So many of us have observed native plants emerging in areas that have suffered damage. Once the source of damage has ended or been removed, such as fire, storm, land development, etc., natural regeneration of plants can be spontaneous and autonomous. If we seek to mimic nature, we can use this tactic to assist the land or waters to heal themselves. It can be less expensive and more effective over the long term in contrast with restoration strategies that often involve more relatively interventionist activities. In reality, it is not a binary decision. We can also mix and match passive with more active modes of restoration. By focusing on the potential of underground seed banks and passive restoration methods, we elevate patience and a deep relational understanding of natural processes and the balance of human involvement in the care for land and waters. These methods underscore the idea that sometimes the best way to help wider nature is to step back and let it take its course. What is this passive versus active restoration that I'm talking about? Passive ecological restoration is traditionally and quickly defined by minimal human intervention. While I don't fully believe in removing people from the ecosystem, a more passive approach contrasts with active restoration, which includes activities like supplementing an area with native species from another location, applying herbicides, or physically altering the landscape. It isn't simple or even passive for that matter, but doing things such as halting activities like intensive grazing or logging, allowing early successional species to prepare the ground for more complex communities, reestablishing natural water flows to support wetland and riparian habitats, or nurturing soil communities to regenerate are some examples of passive restoration. On the other hand, active restoration strategies involve deliberate human intervention. Many of these I employ myself, and then others get really, sciencey and complicated. Active restoration often involves the painstaking collection and planting of seeds and propagules sourced from local populations or purchased from far away. So by reintroducing plant species that were historically present, active restoration aims to recreate often a plant community structure and species composition, often of a particular historical period. Eradication of non-natives is also something that active restoration frequently employs, using herbicides and mechanical removal to eliminate species that we don't think belong or may outcompete desirable flora. Another example is managing forest structure through thinning and controlled burns, especially after a legacy of industrial forestry. Hydrological restoration is also very active by restoring natural water flows by removing or modifying dams or levees. Activities like recontouring landscapes to their historical topography can help restore natural water drainage patterns as well. And then don't forget that active restoration sometimes involves reintroducing animal species that may have been extirpated from an area. This can help reestablish historical predator-prey dynamics and other ecological interactions that are crucial for ecosystems, like the reintroduction of keystone species such as beavers. The active activities are not necessarily bad, but can be somewhat challenging to accomplish they can be expensive, they can escalate into high-tech fixes, or even privilege a certain snapshot in time and conception of how ecosystems have been maintained. Meanwhile, passive restoration is deeply connected to ecological memory as it relies on the natural regenerative capacities embedded within an ecosystem's history. Without sidelining humans' role in balancing ecosystems, but allowing natural processes to guide recovery, passive restoration supports the reestablishment of historical species compositions, genetic diversity, and ecosystem values we might find desirable. In short, we should be seeking to understand, relate to, and leverage the historical information stored within ecosystems. Now, the term ecological memory sounds poetic to me. It refers to the ability of ecosystems to retain information about their past states and disturbances, which can influence their recovery and future responses to environmental changes. There are some key components of ecological memory. It's maintained through information and material legacies such as species life history traits and vessels like seeds. The seed bank is one of the primary reservoirs of ecological memory. Seeds that are stored or buried in the soil can remain dormant for long periods, waiting for favorable conditions to germinate. This allows ecosystems to recover naturally after disturbances like fires, floods, or human activities. Also, the genetic diversity within plant individuals and animal populations allows for a range of responses to environmental stresses. What we cannot see below ground, like the soil microbial communities, also plays a significant role in nutrient cycling, plant growth, and ecosystem health. So relatively, we would say intact or basically soil that's not dug up and turned upside down can be important reservoirs for ecological memory as well. And then one of my favorite things to think about is these landscape features. Elements such as really old growth individual trees, fallen logs, and dead snags can provide habitat, influence microclimates, and support species that contribute to ecosystem recovery. For example, if you go back to the tree hugger episode in the Wayback Machine about woodpeckers, you hear a lot about primary cavity nesters making way for secondary cavity nesters, and that's all facilitated by what we often say is remnants of a natural disturbance. And the example we want to highlight here is seeds that are preserved in the soil that have been buried. They can spontaneously regenerate once the right conditions appear. So species like willows, tule, and wapato can appear after long periods of absence once water is put back on the land in wetlands. And then one of my favorite, I think, charismatic plants out there is lupins. They're also known for their remarkable longevity and ability to remain viable for extended periods, like often decades. Studies have shown that lupin seeds can maintain their viability for up to 50 years. The long viability is attributed to their hard seed coats, which protect the seeds from environmental conditions and slow down the aging process. The right conditions for emergence typically include adequate moisture, temperature, and sometimes disturbance, such as soil turnover or fire, which can break the seed coat and trigger germination. And then there's factors influencing longevity. The longevity of lupin seeds can be influenced by various factors, including storage conditions. Seeds stored in cool, dry, and dark conditions are likely to remain viable longer than those exposed to heat, moisture, and light. Additionally, seeds that remain buried in the soil can be protected from temperature fluctuations and predation, further extending their viability. So how do we work with ecological memory? This is a short but non-exhaustive list, and I think maybe a little vague and ambiguous as well, but we can support succession and recovery. So if you believe in ecological succession, it's a natural process of recovery following a disturbance. It's a mechanism from which ecological memory is expressed. There are species we often think that are early to arrive to a spot. They may prepare the environment for species that come later, that show up later, gradually leading to a relatively mature or late successional ecosystem that resembles perhaps a pre-disturbance state or perhaps expresses a lot of values and services that we find desirable. Don't forget about species interactions. So those interactions between species, such as pollination, seed dispersal, and symbiotic relationships, are crucial for maintaining ecological memory. So, of course, I think the more tangible things we could do is put out pollinator-friendly plants. Even if they don't track with historical fidelity, they may not be the long-term winners on the site. They may not persist. spending the time looking at which pollinators are present and which ones you might want to attract might help dictate what you end up planting. And don't forget the human practices. The traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous and traditional land management practices, such as controlled burns and selective harvesting, can enhance ecological memory. These practices are based on a deep understanding of the local environment and its natural cycles, contributing to resilience and the health of ecosystems. So ecological restoration helps natural recovery by restoring conditions that support plant and animal life cycles, promoting ecosystem strength and independence. I don't think we've talked about ecological memory before on the podcast, but I think it's a fundamental concept to help guide our restoration efforts. While we should focus on using the regenerative ability of those species that emerge from the site autonomously and independently, sometimes heavily degraded ecosystems might need significant intervention, including assessments, observation, and the reintroduction of those missing elements. These activities may require continuous adjustments and follow-ups to handle the unexpected challenges and ensure successful restorations. That wraps up this episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Please check the show description for more information about underground seed banks, passive restoration, and ecological memory. Remember, it takes a community to keep a podcast like this going. As an independent show, every contribution makes a difference. If you'd like to support us, you can donate via the mobile payment services at the links provided in the show notes. Your generosity helps cover the small overhead costs in producing the show. Find the podcast on social media at Tree Hugger Pod to stay updated and join the conversation. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your preferred podcast platform. Your support helps others find the show. And don't forget to tell your friends about us too. Thanks for listening. See you in the woods.